Hi, my name is Roderick Currie, and this is my presentation on hacking the CAN bus. So before I begin, I'd like to give you some quick background information on me. I am an information security professional with a large aerospace company. I have over 12 years of experience in the field. My current role is Information Systems Security Manager, or ISSM, at a large flight test facility in Southern California, where I oversee a handful of high-profile flight test programs. I'm also currently pursuing a master's degree from STI with a planned graduation date of July of 2017. As for certifications, I currently hold the CISSP and Security Plus certs, as well as a healthy list of GX certs as shown here on the slide. So this is a car hacking presentation that focuses primarily on the CAN bus vehicle architecture, or Controller Area Network Bus. The presentation will provide some background information on the CAN bus, explaining why the CAN bus is so insecure today. The presentation should hopefully give an understanding of how car hacking, for the purpose of security research, helps to contribute to a more secure end product for consumers. The presentation will then go into detail on the hardware and software and methodology required to hack a modern vehicle. And finally, I'll be sharing some results of some basic car hacking that I performed against my own vehicle to demonstrate just how insecure the CAN bus really is. Before getting into the technical details of how to perform CAN bus hacking, it's important to first consider the rationale for hacking cars. One key reason to hack cars is to highlight vulnerabilities in outdated and archaic vehicle bus systems. So the CAN bus dates back to the 1980s, and today it's almost as insecure as it was back then. By performing attacks against the CAN bus to highlight vulnerabilities, it's my hope that automakers can pay attention and can better secure their systems going forward. Another key reason to hack cars is to steer automakers away from the security by obscurity model. Now, security by obscurity, which is a favorite of the auto industry, simply doesn't work. Rather than investing in security solutions, the big automakers have a tendency to cut corners on security in favor of cost savings. This is a decision that's often made in the corporate boardroom, but until vehicle hacking becomes more commonplace, the automakers believe that it doesn't warrant a significant amount of attention or budget. Unfortunately, ignoring these vulnerabilities or attempting to hide vulnerabilities just doesn't lead to more secure systems. The only way to overcome this flawed model is to increase public awareness of security vulnerabilities. And so another goal of this project is to increase awareness of the degree to which modern vehicular systems are insecure. And finally, car hacking can also be thought of as a type of security audit. By auditing the security of one's own vehicle, it's possible to gain a better understanding of the ways in which the vehicle might be vulnerable to attack and to take precautions accordingly. So most computer users wouldn't trust a new software application if they knew that it had not undergone extensive security testing by the developer. So then why should we entrust our safety and the safety of our loved ones to vehicle systems that are not audited for security by their manufacturers? Recently, automotive cybersecurity has begun to receive increased attention from the public. This is due in part to several high-profile examples of vehicle hacking that have been picked up by the mainstream media. Back in 2011, a team of researchers from the University of Washington and UC San Diego demonstrated that remote exploitation was feasible via a broad range of attack vectors, including CD players, Bluetooth, and cellular radio. So this research showed just how many different potential points of entry were available on a typical modern vehicle. And a few years later, in 2015, researchers Charlie Miller and Chris Valasek demonstrated a remote exploitation of an unaltered passenger vehicle via the vehicle's cellular interface. Now, this attack took advantage of a vulnerability in the Sprint cellular network and the onboard Uconnect infotainment system in a 2014 Jeep Cherokee. That attack allowed Miller and Valasek to remotely take over the Jeep's steering, transmission, and brakes, and the aftermath of that attack is shown here in the photo on the slide. Then in September 2016, a group of researchers from the Keen Security Lab demonstrated an attack against a Tesla Model S vehicle. That team performed a wireless attack that required no physical access to the Tesla vehicle, and ultimately they were able to partially take over control of that vehicle. The attack required the Tesla to be connected to a malicious Wi-Fi hotspot and also took advantage of a vulnerability in the vehicle's integrated web browser. So as modern vehicles like the Tesla incorporate more connectivity features, such as onboard Wi-Fi and integrated web browsers, this only increases the attack surface and creates new potential points of entry for attackers. So clearly, gaining remote access to a modern vehicle is relatively trivial. And so this project focuses on vulnerabilities within a vehicle's network rather than attempting to infiltrate the vehicle's perimeter defenses. So a question I often get asked is, isn't it illegal to hack cars? And the answer is, well, it depends. So historically, vehicle security researchers have faced a number of legal challenges. Back in 2012, a group of academic security researchers discovered a security flaw in the engine immobilizer system of a number of different vehicles. So in the spirit of information sharing, that team reached out to the automakers to inform them about the vulnerability. The team also shared their intent to publish their findings publicly at an upcoming security conference. Now, the list of impacted vehicles included vehicles from a number of Volkswagen brands, including Porsche, Audi, Bentley, and Lamborghini. So Volkswagen was concerned that public disclosure of this vulnerability would benefit car thieves and would require an expensive recall of all the affected vehicles to remediate the problem. So before the team could publish their findings, Volkswagen went ahead and filed a lawsuit to block the publication of the paper. Until recently, car hacking, even for the purpose of security research, has been illegal in the United States under the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, or DMCA. The DMCA was signed by President Clinton in 1998 and generally prohibits any modification of copyrighted software or bypassing any kind of access control technologies. So the DMCA was originally intended to protect publishers of traditional computer software, but nonetheless it also extended to systems found in modern automobiles. A particular section of the DMCA prohibits the reverse engineering of computer software even for security research purposes, and even if the researcher has purchased the software and owns the device on which that software runs. So the DMCA has long served as a deterrent to automotive security research. But thankfully, in October of 2015, a number of exemptions to the DMCA were signed into law, allowing good faith security research. And because of a 1-year delay in implementation of those exemptions, they did not legally take effect until October of 2016. So now that car hacking for the purpose of security research is no longer illegal under copyright law, there's no longer a fear of lawsuits hanging over the heads of security researchers. But it's also important to note that the new exemptions still don't permit modification of a vehicle's telematics or infotainment systems, nor do they permit any modification that would violate any other laws, such as emissions regulations. Additionally, modification of a vehicle's odometer reading is also illegal under US law. So now let's look in more detail at the CAN bus. Development of the CAN bus began in 1983 with German company Robert Bosch. After 3 years of development, the CAN bus technology hit the public market in 1986, first showing up in the BMW 850 Coupe. So up until the release of that vehicle, a car's various electronic components would have been connected through dedicated point-to-point wiring harnesses. So the creation of the CAN bus helped to eliminate the need for most of that bulky wiring and resulted in a weight reduction of over 100 pounds per vehicle. Despite the obvious benefits of weight reduction, there was also another driving factor in the development of the CAN bus. Because of the more stringent vehicle emissions requirements of the 1970s and early 1980s, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration and the California Air Resources Board were looking for a way to easily monitor a vehicle's emission control systems. So these federal and state mandates led to the creation of the Onboard Diagnostic Protocol, also known as OBD. The Onboard Diagnostic Protocol features an OBD port, now known as the OBD-II port, which represents the most direct interface to a vehicle's CAN bus. And so hacking a car via the OBD-II port has been criticized in the past as an unrealistic attack model. So certainly there is a consensus that a real-world attacker is not likely to have direct physical access to the OBD-II port. However, it's also clear from existing research that the modern connected car has a very broad attack surface and a wide array of possible entry points. The remote exploitation of a vehicle is a lot more dramatic and tends to get a lot more media attention, but nonetheless, wired direct access to the OBD-II port is still a viable way of determining how a vehicle can be manipulated after access has been established, and it should not be labeled as an incomplete attack model. On most vehicles, the OBD-II port is usually found underneath the dashboard, and the OBD-II standard requires the port to be located within 3 feet of the driver and to be accessible without the need for tools. The OBD-II connector, shown on the slide here, has a standard pinout, and the most important pins for the scope of this research are pins number 6 and 14, which are dedicated to the CAN bus. So shown here is the hardware required for some basic vehicle manipulation. Since car hacking via the OBD-II port requires a physical connection to the car, it's best carried out from inside the vehicle, meaning that a laptop computer is going to be necessary for sniffing and crafting packets. The specific laptop I selected for this research is an older Lenovo ThinkPad T420. This is a standard laptop computer which was chosen mainly because it's certified by Ubuntu as supporting the Ubuntu 12.04 operating system. Also required is a CAN to USB interface device. So there are numerous CAN to USB devices available on the market. Some are considerably more expensive than others. Because this device acts as the laptop computer's interface to the CAN bus, it's a lot more complex than just a simple adapter cable. It's really an intelligent device that performs onboard processing of CAN packets. So the interface of choice for this project is CANtact. Now the CANtact device was chosen for its affordability, its compatibility, and its open source nature. The CANtact device can best be thought of as a network interface card, allowing the laptop computer to join and participate on the CAN bus. The CANtact device is seen by the computer's operating system as a CAN interface, and the computer is able to configure the settings of the interface to communicate with the target vehicle. Once that link is established, the CANtact interface will tunnel any CAN packets between the vehicle and the laptop computer. Also necessary are some cables. So getting the vehicle's CAN messages from the OBD-II port to the CANtact device requires an OBD-II to DB9 serial cable. Now this one is nothing more than a dumb cable that swaps the OBD-II signal to the serial pinout so that it can be received by the CANtact device. And once the CAN messages from the vehicle have been processed by the CANtact device, they are then output to a USB type B port, which means that a USB B to USB A cable is also necessary to connect the CANtact device to the laptop computer. Looking at the software required for car hacking, my operating system of choice is Ubuntu 12.04. However, it's worth mentioning that car hacking doesn't explicitly require a Linux operating system. Car hacking can also be performed on Windows. There are a number of GUI-driven applications available on the market that can perform many of the same functions. However, in general, the vehicle security research community has favored Linux, and therefore many of the open source tools and devices available on the market are designed primarily for use with Linux. Another important reason that the community favors Linux-based operating systems is the Linux Socket CAN package. So Socket CAN is the Linux standard implementation of CAN protocols and CAN device drivers. And Socket CAN has been part of the kernel since April 2008. So in order to utilize Socket CAN, it's essential to choose an operating system that runs kernel version 2.6.25 or later from April 2008 onwards. Since the release of Socket CAN, Linux has offered native support for CAN devices at the network layer. Socket CAN was originally developed by Volkswagen and was contributed to the Linux kernel as an open source framework. So one of the stated goals of the Socket CAN framework was to make CAN communications as much as possible similar to the use of TCP IP sockets. And this is exactly what makes Socket CAN so versatile. So when using Socket CAN, CAN devices in Linux behave in much the same way as traditional TCP IP sockets, and this greatly reduces the learning curve when communicating with CAN devices. Also, the Socket CAN package includes a number of useful tools, which are listed here, known as can-utils. CAN-dump is one of those. As the name implies, CAN-dump is used to dump all CAN packets directly to the console. CAN send is another useful utility. That utility allows a single CAN packet to be sent out onto the CAN bus. And perhaps one of the most useful utilities for CAN bus reverse engineering is CAN sniffer. So CAN sniffer performs real-time filtering of the on-screen output. So much like CAN dump, but with the benefit of color coding and filtering out message IDs which are not useful. So by filtering out the noise, CAN sniffer lets a researcher focus only on the most relevant CAN packets. Switching gears now, I'd like to share what happened when I performed some basic car hacking against my own vehicle. So this is the target car. This project focuses on the CAN bus of my 2011 Honda Civic LX 4-door sedan. Now, it's true that this car is already 6 years old. However, many of the same techniques described here can be applied to newer vehicles with similar results. Because of that OBD-II federal mandate, the majority of new vehicles feature a CAN bus that's very similar to that of my 2011 Honda Civic. So knowing the target vehicle is essential. And for this project, I used a paid subscription to an online repair data service to get wiring diagrams and schematics for my vehicle. And by doing that, I discovered that my Honda Civic has two separate CAN bus backbones. It has the fast CAN, known as FCAN, and the body CAN, also known as BCAN. So the FCAN bus deals with the more critical components of the car, such as the engine, transmission, steering, and brakes. And the vehicle's gauge cluster is also located on the FCAN bus. The FCAN uses a pair of wires operating at a speed of 500 kilobits per second. Now the BCAN, on the other hand, is a single wire bus which operates at a much lower speed of 33 kilobits per second. And that BCAN bus is responsible for much less critical functions such as the radio, windows, door locks, and comfort settings. So because of the high criticality of the components on the FCAN bus, I decided to focus on accessing FCAN to demonstrate just how vulnerable some of a modern vehicle's components are to unauthorized access and manipulation. One of the first steps in CAN bus hacking is to perform some basic reconnaissance to learn how the vehicle works. So with the hardware connected up to the OBD-II port, a quick and easy way to test if CAN packets are being successfully received is to run CAN dump. Now, the first time CAN dump is run, it should output a host of CAN messages to the screen. And this raw and unfiltered CAN dump output might not be very useful, but it's still a great way to confirm that the serial CAN interface is working correctly. So a better way to make the CAN output more manageable is to run CAN sniffer. CAN sniffer performs real-time filtering of the CAN messages that it receives. So any message that remains unchanged will be filtered out, making the output more readable and more useful. So CAN sniffer displays only the messages that are changing, and even goes one step further by highlighting the changing bytes in color. So by physically manipulating functions of the vehicle and observing the changing CAN bytes, it's possible to start mapping out which message IDs and which message data correspond to particular vehicle functions. For example, on my vehicle, shifting the gear lever from park to reverse causes a change in message ID 188, and more specifically, byte number 4 of that message changes from a value of 01 for park to a value of 02 for reverse. So recording and mapping out these specific pieces of data is crucial to gaining a better understanding of how CAN communication takes place on the target vehicle. In my case, after a significant amount of time experimenting and performing reconnaissance on the 2011 Honda Civic, I managed to build a table of vehicle functions and their corresponding CAN messages, and I deciphered everything from engine RPM, vehicle speed, gas pedal position, gear selection, headlights, turn signals, and much more. So in order to communicate with the target vehicle, I mentioned that the can send utility allows a single packet to be sent to the vehicle. However, communicating with the vehicle in any meaningful way requires a continuous stream of packets to be sent. So that's when we use the CAN player utility. The CAN player utility takes a CAN log file and replays it back to the vehicle with the same original timing as the recording. But before we can utilize CAN player, we first have to generate a CAN dump log file. So an example of the CAN dump log file is shown here on the slide. The first column of the log file represents the current date and time in what's known as epoch time, which should be familiar to Linux users. This is essentially the number of seconds that have elapsed since January 1st of 1970. Now, the time itself is not important. What is important for CAN player is the time increment from one line to the next. So when playing back a log file, CAN player plays the first line immediately, and then it waits the amount of the incremental time difference before playing the next line. So looking at the example here on the slide, each line would be played at an interval of 0.02 seconds or 20 milliseconds between lines. The second column of the log file is the name of the interface over which the CAN message should be sent. And the third column of the log file is the CAN message itself. So in this case, the first three digits of that CAN message represent the message ID. The pound symbol is used to separate the message ID from the message body. And the characters that follow are the hexadecimal CAN message data. So in this particular example, what's happening is the message is telling the tachometer to display a reading of 2000 RPM. And because the message is repeated 7 times at an interval of 20 milliseconds between each line, the message would be expected to last for 140 milliseconds, or just a fraction of a second. So for a CAN log file to have any real impact on the vehicle, it usually has to be hundreds or even thousands of lines in length. So for the purposes of my research, I found that the best way or the most efficient way to create a long custom CAN log file was to use Microsoft Excel and its native formula functionality. And in Excel, the playback file can be saved as a .log file and then can be played back by the CAN player utility. So as I said about trying to manipulate my own vehicle, I first set my sights on the vehicle's tachometer. By listening to CAN traffic and deciphering messages, I learned that engine RPM data being displayed on the tachometer comes from CAN messages with an ID of 1 DC. Under normal conditions, the engine would broadcast a 1 DC message on the CAN bus every 20 milliseconds. Then the gauge cluster would listen on the CAN bus for any messages with the 1 DC identifier. And every time a message with that ID was received, the position of the needle on the tachometer would be updated accordingly. So a typical RPM 1 DC message is shown here on the slide. breaking down the message, the first byte of data I found would never change from a value of 02. However, the 3 bytes that follow are essentially a hexadecimal representation of the actual engine RPM, which has been encoded using a basic algorithm. So after some experimentation, I found the algorithm shown here at the bottom of the slide could be used to derive the human readable RPM from the hex data. Essentially what you're doing is you take the last 3 bytes of data, convert those to decimal, divide that result by 500, and the result is the human readable engine RPM. So when the CAN message shown here on the slide was played back to the vehicle continuously, the needle of the tachometer would move to approximately 8,000 RPM every time. And so that validated the algorithm, and that also showed that reverse engineering of RPM messages could be performed by picking first a desired RPM and then running it through the algorithm in reverse to determine the CAN message for that RPM. So after determining the different CAN messages required for different RPM readings, I created a custom log file, which I could use CAN Player to play that file back to the vehicle, and that gave full control of the vehicle's tachometer. The file I created was 600 lines in length, and that resulted in 12 seconds of uninterrupted control of the vehicle's tachometer. It's actually possible to create even longer files or to use a scripting language like Python to establish indefinite control. However, I felt that a 12-second demonstration was sufficient to show that the tachometer had been successfully manipulated. And what I'd like to do now is show a video of that particular attack as it was carried out. Next, I turn my attention to the vehicle's speedometer. So the technique used to manipulate the vehicle's speedometer is similar to that used on the tachometer. However, I found that vehicle speed data uses a different CAN message ID and a more complex message structure. Through a process of elimination, I found that the message ID for speedometer data was 158. Unlike the engine RPM messages, which had a length of 4 bytes, a normal 158 speed message has a length of 8 bytes. And whereas the engine RPM messages were being broadcast every 20 milliseconds, I found that the speed messages were being broadcast every 10 milliseconds. So after a significant amount of time road testing and experimenting, I learned that only bytes 5 and byte 6 were responsible for the speed data being displayed on the speedometer. The algorithm shown at the bottom of the slide shows how to convert a 158 message into vehicle speed in miles per hour. So taking bytes 5 and 6, those are first converted to decimal. Then it's worth noting that on the target vehicle and on most vehicles, the ECU actually processes vehicle speed in kilometers per hour. So the fact that we see speed in miles per hour is simply a display setting. So the next step in the algorithm is to multiply the decimal number by 0.621371119, which happens to be the ratio of kilometers to miles. Once we've done that, it's also necessary to divide the resulting value by 100 so we can position the decimal point correctly. And the end result is the vehicle's speed. The method that I used to demonstrate manipulation of the vehicle's speedometer was similar to that used previously on the tachometer. So a custom log file was played back using CAN player, and that would override the vehicle's true speed data and replace it with the spoofed speed data on the screen. And this proved to be possible regardless of whether the vehicle was actually moving or not. I found that the vehicle speedometer could be manipulated for up to several minutes at a time, and I'd like to roll another video, this time showing the speedometer attack underway. Now we turn our attention to the vehicle's odometer. So the odometer displays the number of miles that a vehicle has traveled in its lifetime. The way that the odometer is managed will vary from one vehicle to the next. On some vehicles, the odometer value in miles or in kilometers is constantly being broadcast on the CAN bus. However, on my target vehicle, the odometer value is actually stored within the gauge cluster itself. So, on my vehicle, the odometer value is actually not transmitted over the CAN bus. Instead, what happens is the engine transmits a periodic CAN message to the gauge cluster to increment the odometer value. So the frequency of these increment commands depends upon how fast the vehicle is traveling. The gauge cluster listens for that signal, and it increments the odometer every time an increment command is received from the engine. So this means that it's still possible to manipulate the odometer to some extent through reverse engineering. I found that the odometer signal is also contained in message ID 158, which is the same message responsible for speed and other engine data. However, byte 7 is used for the odometer increment signal. So the key to manipulating the odometer is to duplicate that incrementation signal, and in theory, doing this with a minimal length of time between increments should cause the odometer readout to increase more rapidly. And just as with the tachometer and the speedometer hacks, the easiest way to manipulate the odometer is to play back a custom log file using CAN player. And I'd like to roll another video showing just what happened when I performed that attack against my vehicle's odometer. The specific attacks that I've demonstrated here might seem insignificant since they don't directly impact the safety or the control of the vehicle. But my intent with this research was to show just how easily an unauthorized device could join the CAN bus and manipulate the vehicle. by controlling the data that's being displayed on the vehicle's gauge cluster, this is an effective way to demonstrate manipulation of the CAN bus because it provides a clear visual indicator of a successful attack. This is just the same as the way a hacker might breach a web server and deface the website to show a successful exploit. And what's especially alarming to me about this research is that the same network bus that I exploited to manipulate the gauge cluster also handles communication for the engine, the transmission, the brakes, the steering. So on a newer, more connected vehicle with a greater amount of computerization, the same techniques demonstrated here could be used to take full control of the vehicle and create a dangerous or even deadly situation. By showing ways that the CAN bus can be manipulated using nothing more than basic computer hardware, this presentation has shown just how insecure the CAN bus architecture really is. And unfortunately, without a revision of the federal law that mandates the OBD-II standard, the CAN bus isn't going away anytime soon. The CAN bus is going to remain at the core of modern vehicles for many years to come. And with the auto industry now approaching fully autonomous vehicle technology and more interconnectivity than ever before, vehicle manufacturers just can no longer ignore the vulnerabilities of the CAN bus. Obviously, the problem of securing vehicular systems is very complex, but the responsibility lies with the automakers to face the challenge and take proactive steps to secure their products. But in the meantime, the best way that we can provoke the automakers to action is to increase public awareness of the underlying problem so that it can no longer be ignored. And so I hope that the research presented here will inspire other researchers to undertake car hacking projects of their own for the good of the automobile industry and for the good of the public as a whole.